We're a little late, and we've actually got a very full final session, so we'll make a start. This is also our final session, the closing session, and I do want to make a few comments and give some thanks at the end, but I'll leave that to the end of this session, so please do stay right through to the end. This is the closing plenary, and it's a very full session. We've got two reports being presented, and then really some words from our sponsor and comments from the ADB, not on a report but on their strategy. So just to go through quickly, we're first of all going to hear from Josefa Mayava, who's the head of the Pacific office for UNESCAP here in Suva. And he'll be presenting their new 2017 report, Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific, with the special theme of improving governance and financial management. I'll introduce Josefa in a minute. We'll then hand over to the World Bank, in particular Robert Utz, lead economist in Sydney with the World Bank, and he'll be presenting on the report he's been working on, I think, for the last couple of years now, Pacific Possible. And last year, in fact, I presented on the Labour Mobility Report. There have been a number of separate reports. He's going to give us the synthesis. And then finally, we'll hear from Emma Veve, who you all know well, who's the Director of Urban Social Development and Public Management Division in the Asian Development Bank. And she'll be talking on ADB regional priorities, responding to the changing needs of the Pacific. So each speaker is limited to 15 minutes, and we have our very efficient and rigorous timekeepers. And that should leave some time for questions. We won't go on for too long. I'm sure you're all tired and ready to call it a day. So let me introduce our first speaker, Josefa Mayava. He is the United Nations head of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, Pacific Office, the head of the Pacific Office for UNESCAP. He graduated from none other than the Australian National University, with a Masters of International Relations. And I will just say, if you don't know me, my name's Stephen Howes. I'm also from the Australian National University, where I direct the Development Policy Centre. Josefa served as Deputy Secretary General to the PIF Secretariat from 1999 until taking up his current position at UNESCAP. From there he went to take up the position of Secretary of Foreign Affairs and Trade for the government of Nauru. And in 2007 and then 2008, was appointed to his current position. And as I mentioned, Josefa is going to present to us the 2017 Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific, improving governance and fiscal management. So please welcome Josefa Mayava. So just use that. Okay.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. This was not planned, so all the more sense of appreciation that we have for this opportunity to talk about this this report. And I just want to start by just flashing on the screen a message from the Secretary General on this report, which identifies governance and in particular fiscal management as a key factor in improving long-term economic prospects while grappling with social and economic challenges. Importantly, I think the report does highlight the need to build trust between governments and peoples and among countries as a top priority. And he said that he wanted to commend this survey to a wide global audience, so we are very grateful that we have this audience to share this information with. Key messages from the report. The first message I want to make is that we do appreciate very much the contribution that's been made by Nilesh Gaunda and a few others from USB in the conceptualization of this report through the experts working group that we convened, which Nilesh kindly participated in. The other messages that you see on the screen is that economic growth relatively modest in the Asia-Pacific region, with mild economic expansion expected ahead. You know that, most of you do. Countries in the region could strengthen domestic and regional drivers of economic growth, including agriculture, construction, tourism, wholesale, retail trade, given the expected weaknesses in the external demand and the phenomena of rising protectionist measures. The main message, however, is that effective fiscal management backed by improved governance can improve long-term economic prospects and help address social issues such as NCDs and gender disparity and environmental concerns such as the ones related to oceans and climate change. And given the increasing demand on public spending and on the projections that we've heard at this conference about the fiscal deficits, gaps looking into the future, I think the role of governance in mobilizing and the allocation of public funds warrants greater attention than has been. So, I mean, it's an old message, but one that is in need of repeating, which is that enhancing transparency and accountability in public fiscal administration is fundamental to improving the quality of governance and achieving better fiscal management. You know, looking at the Pacific, and there is a section in the report in Chapter 2 on sub-regional perspectives that has a short overview on macroeconomic sort of situation in the Pacific Island countries, including Australia and New Zealand, by the way. But I will not dwell on the macroeconomic performances and forecast aspect of the survey, as these have been covered, many of these issues have been covered during this conference. Instead, I will focus on the theme of the survey, which is on governance and fiscal management, issues that I hope you agree deserve more attention in the Pacific. That is except to say that as a group, economic growth in Pacific Island developing economies dipped to 2.6% in 2016 from 7.1% in 2015. The sharp slowdown, as you know, was driven by the relatively lower economic expansion in Papua New Guinea, which accounts for 60% of the outputs in the developing economies of this sub-region of the Pacific, as you also know, owing to subdued prices and reduced exports of minerals from that country. The slower overall economic growth in 2016, however, masks the fact that growth performance indeed improved in about half of the Pacific Island economies, including Cook Islands, Marshall Islands, Nauru, Samoa, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. More positive still is the fact that 2016 marked the first time in decades that all Pacific Island economies recorded positive economic growth. You know, such across-the-board economic expansion has been a rare event, but because most of the economies are highly vulnerable to external shocks such as natural disasters and declining commodity prices. So I think it's a good news that we need to appreciate. The near-term growth outlook is expected to improve modestly, with growth projected to be about 3.1% in 2017, and the improved prospects benefit from such factors as an expected rise in global commodity prices, steady economic growth in key trading partners, particularly Australia and New Zealand, and note here with appreciation the positive impact that Australia and New Zealand has had on the positive growth that we've seen in Pacific Island economies. looking more at governance and development as a two-way relationship, you see on the left. By the way, governance in this report is framed in terms of how power is being exercised, in terms of better public service delivery, and not so much on how it is acquired, which of course might be different from the way some of you understand governance, but that's the way governance is framed in this report. And the governance index used in this report, out of the World Bank's 6 criteria, 4 have been used in this report: government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. And as you can see on the left-hand side, it shows that the governance quality in Asia-Pacific small island developing states, which include, in addition to Pacific Island countries, Maldives and Timor-Leste, is better than some parts of the Asia-Pacific region, but is still lower than developed countries and, more importantly, Latin American and Caribbean region. And sort of another old message that needs to be repeated, perhaps with evidence, is that governance and development is a two-way relationship, and you can see that on the right-hand side, where level of economic development, average years of total schooling of 1564 age group, natural resource rent, and the percentage of the 1564 age group which did not attend school are correlated with the degree or extent of governance in the countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Governance affects both the allocation and the efficiency of public expenditure. And we've got here some examples from Asia on this positive correlation between high quality of governance and efficiency in public spending. Later on in this presentation, we'll look at how targeted public expenditure can lead to better health outcomes in the Pacific, bearing in mind the need for associated good governance measures. And we see here a sort of correlation between better governance and higher levels of tax revenue, as you can see with the trend line, how the revenue improves with improvement in governance. And you also see here the estimated impact of governance on tax revenue collection in some of the Asian countries, which I think may be relevant to the Pacific as well. And so we spoke early on about trust, the Secretary General emphasizing the need to build trust. This kind of flow chart can explain how this can happen, starting from the bottom with better production and access to data and information, better control and audit, better feedback systems, including have inclusive institution of e-governance. That leads to greater transparency and more accountability, to better governance, and then to better government revenue collection because of higher taxes and non-tax revenues resulting from improved governance. And then, of course, more efficiency on the side of public expenditure. And then you see at the top how this idea of tax morale reinforces each other, and ex-taxpayers see that their tax is being better used, understand the value of their taxes, they'll be more encouraged, incentivized to pay and improve the level of compliance as a result of that. So that is essentially what is meant by boosting tax morale in order to help improve tax revenues. So this is the case study that is in the report on the Pacific, how fiscal policy can improve health outcomes. I think it's understood that achieving better health outcomes remains one of the policy priorities for the Pacific Island developing economies. Several economies have not fully achieved the MDGs on health issues, especially those relating to maternal health, HIV/AIDS, and malaria. Meeting the SDGs on health issues is arguably a more complex issue now than it was during the MDG time. So let me focus on the use of fiscal policy tools to address the prevalence of non-communicable diseases, NCDs. Fiscal policy has great potential to deal with NCDs as those tools incentivizes changes in behavioral factors, and we heard this morning from one of our development economists how economic policy had evolved into appreciating behavioral economics. I think this is a case in point of how the incentivization of certain behavioral factors can help address these diseases relating to, for example, behavior related to unhealthy diet, tobacco use, and fiscal inactivity. Public spending on health in most Pacific Island countries is currently quite sizable at 13.3% on average in 2014, and that's double that of the world's lower middle income countries. So lagging health outcomes in several countries casts doubt on the effectiveness of health spending. After all, that's quite a hefty chunk of the government budget. Evidence from Pacific Island developing economies shows that the reorientation of public health spending towards preventative care, specialized health services, and early treatment can be very cost effective. In Vanuatu, every person who managed behavioral risks through primary prevention and successfully avoided becoming a type 2 diabetes patient saved the government about 347 per year, or more than double the annual per capita public spending on health. In Tonga, expenditures on NCDs more than tripled as care progresses from the level of health centers to outpatient clinic at the main hospital, and increases ninefold as treatment advances from outpatient to inpatient care. In Samoa, a diabetic foot clinic has avoided many amputations to treat sepsis and reduce treatment costs eightfold when compared with admitting a client with diabetic foot sepsis into the hospital. So strengthening public financial management, which often in the Pacific Island economies is characterized by slow disbursement of funds, under and overspending of budgeted expenditure, limited links between government plans and medium-term budgets, and weak procurement, will enhance health services by making it more transparent and more responsive. Addressing non-communicable diseases requires stronger and broader policy efforts. For instance, tobacco taxes have been raised in recent years in several Pacific Island developing economies, but there appears to be room for further increases. And then finally, spending on preventative measures remains inadequate. And during the period 26 to 27, less than 2% of health funds in Samoa, Tonga, and Vanuatu were used for preventative healthcare promotion and activities. So very quickly, key takeaway points. We've got them on the screen, so you read them and take them at your leisure. Thank you very much. And this is what the report looks like, by the way.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Youssef. And I think that reflected a number of points made in some of the sessions earlier on today and yesterday, just around the importance of fiscal management, governance, and anti-corruption. We'll save the questions for the end, and we'll go on now to our second presentation, which is by Robert Utz. Robert is the lead economist for the World Bank for the Pacific region, based in Sydney. And he, among his various responsibilities, he's been the lead author of the bank flagship report, Pacific Possible, and he'll be presenting the Pacific Possible main report today. Prior to his current assignment, Robert served as country economist for several African countries. He also has had corporate roles in the bank, working on IDA. And before joining the World Bank 20 years ago, Robert headed the UNDP. Worked for UNDP in Mauritius and Seychelles, so he's familiar with island economies. So please welcome Robert Utz to present Pacific Possible.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Stephen, for the introduction, and thank you also to USB, to ADP, and for ANU for organizing the conference, which is really a very interesting event, and thanks for inviting us. So I'm going to present Pacific Possible. This is a piece of, actually we call it a program of dialogue and research that we've been carrying out over the past 2 years, and that looks at long-term economic transformative opportunities and challenges. And the starting point for this is really looking at economic growth in the Pacific region. What you see on this chart is in yellow you see real GDP growth over the past 10 years, so the period 2005 to 2015, and in blue you see per capita real GDP growth over the same period. And starting on the left, we have the comparator countries. You have developing East Asia, which has been growing very fast over the past 10 years, driven by China, but also other countries which have been able to achieve annual growth rates of 7 to 8% over the period. If you look at another comparator, middle income countries, growth already is a little lower, but still, quite respectable, in the range of around 4 to 5%. And then if you come to the group of small states, the third group of comparators, again, growth lower, but still, the real GDP growth has been more than 4%, and per capita GDP growth still has been 3%. That's the global comparison that the Pacific has to look up to. And if we now look at the countries, we have grouped them by country groups, so starting with Melanesia, then moving on to Polynesia and Micronesia. The Melanesian countries still have done fairly well over the past 10 years. So you have had Fiji, which where growth has been driven by the tourism sector. You have Papua New Guinea, where economic growth has been driven by the mining sector, the LNG investments. So these growth figures go until 2015, so really before the commodity decline hit PNG. You have Solomon Islands, which over the period grew as a combination of recovery from the tensions, but also continuous increases in logging. And you have Vanuatu, which also has done quite well on the tourism sector side. So Melanesia has done well, but actually, looking forward, I think, the outlook, at least the medium-term outlook for Melanesia is also not that bright. You have PNG, which right now is in a difficult situation due to the drop in commodity prices, and you have Solomon Islands, where I think people have been predicting for a long time that the extent of logging is not sustainable, and we also see that the recovery that characterized most of the period after the tensions also now is pretty much coming to an end, also with Ramsey moving out. Now moving on to Polynesia, there you see actually, already growth rates much lower. So actually in Polynesia, and the same for Micronesia, most of these countries, if you look at per capita growth rates, they have been very small, usually less than 1%. And this is really what is driving the study that we undertook. We were asking ourselves, looking at these historic growth rates where economic growth was stagnant, meaning also that standards of living and well-being in the Pacific has been stagnant over the past 10 years and probably going back even further. Is this the future? If we look forward one generation, if we look over the next 25 years, can we expect that actually the economic growth is going to be more or less what it has been in the past, or can we expect a dramatic change? That's what we try to look at. And if you look at economic growth, what explains the low economic growth that Pacific Island countries have experienced, there's really two schools of thought. One school of thought says, well, it's all about policies and policy implementation. So if the Pacific Island countries just were to adopt better policies, if they were to do more for private sector development, if they were to do more for public financial management, they would start to grow. That's one school of thought, and we certainly have heard some of that school over the past 2 days. The other school of thought says, not so fast. Look at the geography of these countries. The Pacific Island countries, they're very small, they're extremely remote, even much more remote than Caribbean islands. In addition, they're geographically dispersed. So it's not even like that you have one remote country, but even that country is spread out over many islands. So that school of thought actually says these economies actually have very few opportunities to be competitive. They're never going to be in the same league as East Asia, where you have had this strong export-driven economic growth. They say, well, it's really geography that constrains economic growth, and this was one of the, I think, main conclusions of a previous project that we did, Pacific Futures, and what that led us to emphasize is, well, economic growth, it's really limited to a few opportunities, mainly connected to natural resources, but what really matters for these countries also are alternative development strategies. It's the issue about labor mobility, that there aren't just enough productive jobs on the islands, so that you really need to look at opportunities for people to use their human capital where it can be productive. It also has led us to a focus on the public sector and foreign aid. What we see in these countries is that the public sectors are, in relation to the size of the economy, they're large, but in absolute terms, they're still very little, and also most of these countries are highly aid dependent. So what we were saying, it's not, that they're going to be able to get rid of aid, that they're going to reduce the size of the public sectors, but it's just a matter of really managing the public sector and managing aid as well as possible, so that the focus should be on this. But then there still was the question, so what are these few economic opportunities, and how much economic growth could you really get if you were to fully exploit these opportunities? And this is really, what Pacific Possible tried to look at. We tried actually to put numbers on these opportunities. We said, well, let's take a 25-year horizon and say, what could it do to economic growth, to employment, to government revenue, if the countries were able to take full advantage of these opportunities? And so we looked at 6 themes. We looked at what we call harnessing the riches of the Pacific Ocean, which is about fisheries and deep sea mining. We looked at labor mobility. We looked at what we call very nicely host to the world, which is about tourism, but also more. It's really about the Pacific Islands being very attractive locations for people to live. So it goes a little beyond the standard tourism. We looked at what we call islands in a sea of knowledge. There we try to explore what does the ICT revolution do to the islands. Now that most of the islands are connected by fiber optic cables, now that most of the countries have liberalized the telecom sectors, what does it do for economic growth? And then we also looked at working together. This also is a long-standing issue in the Pacific, where there have always been these claims that if countries just were to share administrative functions, if they were to work more closely together, that this also could generate important economic gains. And the last issue that we looked at was looking at managing increasing stress on Pacific livelihoods. And there essentially we tried to figure out how costly is climate change going to be for the Pacific Islands, and how costly is the non-communicable diseases crisis going to be. I'll skip over this. And the question also we had to answer is, so, I mean, what is different? Many of these opportunities, tourism, fisheries, they've been around for a long time. Why should we expect, I mean, that over the next 25 years, things are going to be different from what they've been in the past? And there we see a number of regional and global trends that generate new opportunities for the Pacific. The first one is that shift in economic and political power towards East Asia. So we think that creates new opportunities, because over the next 25 years, you're going to have a much larger and wealthier middle class in China. And so this certainly opens up new opportunities for tourism. You see it already in Palau, and we would expect, I mean, that this is going to affect the whole region. We also see demographic trends in the region. I guess I need to move a little faster, because I also actually have a nice video at the end, which is going to take 3 minutes. So we have demographic trends in terms of the societies around the Pacific, in Australia, New Zealand, but also China, Japan. They're aging. And this creates new demands for labor, which probably, I mean, where the Pacific could be a source. We also see technological changes. I already talked about ICT, but for example, also technology for deep sea mining is developing rapidly, so that opens up new opportunities. And we also see a move towards a much more multipolar world. And what this implies is actually, I mean, that the strategic value of sovereignty is likely to increase. So actually, having a seat at the UN, having a seat wherever, I think, I mean, having the allegiance of Pacific Island countries, I think, I mean, countries are probably going to be more willing to provide some support to gain that allegiance. So I think, I mean, that's what we see on the positive side. On the downside, we certainly see climate change, we see the non-communicable disease crisis. We also see that in terms of the global production, we certainly have this trend towards increasing agglomeration and specialization, which certainly could further marginalize the Pacific, as I mean, it certainly is going to be much more concentrated. And then there's also all these issues around the governance of the oceans. So there has been a lot of progress with UNCLOS, but there's certainly still a lot of gray areas that are going to have a huge impact on actually the extent of control of Pacific Island countries over marine resources. Now let me go very quickly through the opportunities and threats, starting with tuna fisheries. I mean, this is actually a huge success story over the past 5 years or so, where actually through the parties to the Nauru Agreement, countries have been able to capture a much bigger share through fisheries license fees. So I think the revenue from fisheries license fees has gone up from less than 100 million only 5 years ago to now I think it's around 500 million that the countries receive in fisheries fees. What we were asking ourselves, is this going to continue? And what our experts came up with, they said, well, I mean, looking towards the future, probably the price of tuna, demand and supply are going to be more or less stable. I think the sustainable fisheries levels also have been reached, so there's not going to be a huge increase in the quantity. But there's scope by improving the current arrangements. There's scope in terms of the membership. So right now you have some of the big resource owners, especially Indonesia and Philippines, are not part of the parties to the Nauru agreement. So if they were to join, that certainly would stabilize the situation. And also right now countries only receive fisheries license fees. But the value chain essentially from the fish resource in the ocean to getting the tuna on the table in Europe, in the US, you have the fishery fleets by distant fishing nations, then you have 3 companies that are buying all the fish, and then you have the fish processing, which mainly takes place in Thailand. And so certainly there we also see opportunities actually for the Pacific Island countries moving up the value chain. I think I really need to move fast. Deep sea mining, this is quite a controversial agenda, but we see around the Pacific countries are issuing licenses. We know in PNG, which is most advanced, they're probably mining could start as soon as 2019. So what we did was just to take stock, what is the situation? Countries do have resources. SPC has done a lot of important work really, I think, on this issue. But in the end, what we came out with is that there's still a lot of unknowns in terms of the economic potential, in terms of the environmental, social, cultural impact of deep sea mining. So we didn't put any numbers to this. All we say is, that countries, should adhere to the precautionary principle, and that it's probably good to invest in creating more knowledge about the ecosystems before forging forward on deep sea mining. So we took a very cautious stand on this. Tourism, I already mentioned it in the beginning. We see a big opportunity from more tourists coming from China and East Asia. We also see opportunities for more high-end resorts in the region. I think the retiree market linked to the demographic developments that I was talking about before is an opportunity, and also getting more of the cruise ships actually located in the Pacific. Right now they're located in Australia, and we think there might be opportunity to have at least 2 cruise ships located in Fiji and 2 in PNG. And adding all this up, essentially we said, this could generate by 2040, we could see an additional 1 million tourists above current trends, which could generate about 1.7 billion in revenue. Knowledge economy, ICT, there we looked at 3 issues. First of all, we said, the future is going to be mobile, so it's really about mobile penetration. It's going to have 3 impacts. One is going to be that we have larger ICT sectors, and in all of the countries they're growing rapidly, and so we would continue this over the next few years also. We see new market opportunities, especially in outsourcing opportunities. So we already see it in Fiji, but we think there's also opportunities in Samoa and Tonga if they get the environment right. And finally, a fairly big impact would be on productivity. And this actually could be quite significant for the Melanesian countries, because they are the largest countries. They are the countries that have a fairly diversified economy, at least compared to the smaller economies, and they also have fairly large productivity gaps. So there we think ICT really could facilitate, the use of knowledge in terms of the dissemination of agricultural technologies and so on. And this could have quite a huge impact in terms of income. So we estimate that could add about 5 billion to incomes in Pacific, but most of it would be in the Melanesian countries. Labor mobility, I think I don't say much about this. I think actually Stephen House, he's the expert on this, who has been working with us on this. But it's just, it's the triple win that we're always talking about. First of all, it's the incomes for migrants, where the study says actually, this could generate incomes for migrants, permanent migrants who go to Australia, New Zealand, the US, of about 13 billion per year. So it's a huge amount in terms of affecting the well-being of Pacific Islanders, but it also would have benefits for the economies themselves in terms of remittances, the economic impact that creates, and it also could create new jobs back home. Non-Communicable Diseases, again, has been a big issue in the Pacific. The ministers of finance have declared it as a regional emergency, and we estimate that unless the measures that are identified in the NCD roadmap are adopted, that this could shave off between 3 and 9% of GDP every year. Last point is climate change and disaster resilience, where we tried to estimate the cost of adaptation. So most of the cost actually would be related to sea level rise, where countries have to invest in seawalls and etc. And there we give quite a large range of the potential cost, between 400 million and 1.2 billion per year. And this just reflects, on the one hand, the uncertainty about actually how severe sea level rise really is going to be. But an important point that we also stress is that there is various strategies actually how to address the issue, and because the financing gap or the financing requirements are certain, to have full adaptation are too large. So we say, well, start with no regret strategies, where you actually do things that you anyway should be doing, no matter whether there's climate change or not. For example, better road maintenance, and then down the list until you really come to investments in adaptation. Now I come to the point where we tried to add it all up, and you have in different colors, you see, actually how much additional growth over the 25 years these different opportunities could generate. So for example, you see in red, which is income, additional income from fisheries, which would be mostly for Tuvalu, Kiribati, but also for FSM. You see in yellow the additional income that you could get from tourism. You see in orange the additional income from labor mobility. There it's interesting because it's not just in terms of the income flows, but it's also in terms of the impact on population. As you have out-migration, actually your population growth goes down, and that in turn is reflected in higher per capita income growth. If we look at per capita income levels in absolute terms, what we see is that if countries take advantage of these opportunities, actually by 2040, we could see that 5 countries, so Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Palau, could have incomes of more than $8,000, and you would have another 5 countries that would have incomes of at least more than $4,000. Only Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands still wouldn't reach $4,000 by 2040, because they're larger economies where actually the opportunities that we discuss in Pacific Possible don't really cover the field for these countries. So I think Solomon Islands, BNG probably deserve a separate discussion. Now I'm coming to the conclusion, so bear with me. Just some of the cross-cutting issues in terms of what we have identified. The first point, and I think the most important point that we're trying to make, is that opportunities for economic growth in the Pacific Island countries are very limited. And at the same time, you also have extremely thin capacities in these countries. So just due to the size, you often have in a policy area just one person working on an issue. So whatever policy reforms you undertake, they really need to focus. So what we say, well, countries need to, first of all, identify where are the opportunities and then really focus on maximizing these opportunities rather than adopting broad-ranged reform agendas on private sector development. Really, if they think about private sector development, they should think about tourism if that's the opportunity for the country, and not about private sector development in abstract. I guess that's a sign that I really need to end, but we highlight investing in people and the importance of regional cooperation instead of competition. So the fisheries agreement is a good example, but certainly there's opportunities also in tourism, in other areas whereby collaborating more closely, the countries really could maximize benefits. And finally, maintaining environmental sustainability is critical because most of the opportunities really do depend on the natural environment, be it tourism, be it deep sea mining, be it fisheries, so really crucial importance of environmental sustainability. Those are the background reports that we've prepared on the various issues. They're available on our website, worldbank/Pacific Possible, and we are going to launch the final report at the Pacific Forum Leaders Meeting in Apia in September, but the draft report is also on the web. And with the permission of the chair, I would have a 2-minute video.
When smiling, that's everything okay. When you keep sad, that means something's wrong.
Me, em Romeo em đã become journalist now.
Live law to become a counsellor.
I want to have a good job.
I'd like to be a big filmmaker in the future.
A social worker.
Work towards starting up my own law firm.
My kids to be educated.
To be a diplomat of my nation.
Seeing how I can inspire young people.
I want to be the best in what I do.
I want to be the first woman Prime Minister of Tonga.
Everyone exists lo di solo everyone must get a plan so get a plan too.
Equalization of opportunities.
A country that is free and equal. More women in power.
Better education and healthcare.
More freedom, a lot more freedom.
Build up a better future with good leaders.
Keep their culture and their traditional knowledge alive.
Better standard of living for everyone.
Development.
To address the issue of climate change.
See Solomon Island go green.
Hopefully we'll have a stronger voice.
To have a Pacific Constitution in the future.
Leaders need to lead.
Less corruption.
Share learning, progress together.
Our land, our ocean, and we as one people in the Pacific.
Everyone here, even if we are coming from different islands, feel like being part of the same big Oceania family.
We already have this really strong sense of community and working together, which is vital for moving forward, and that makes so many things possible.
Everything is already possible. It's just a matter of getting the flashlight and going, there's our youth, we need to take care of them, because in the future they're the one running it.
In the Pacific, it's possible.
It is possible.
In the South Pacific, it's possible.
No, Pacific and possible.
It's possible.
Yes, we can.
It is possible. Lo Pacific and possible.
In the Pacific, it is possible.
Serious guy.
You know me, brother. It is possible.
At the report, and great to see that video and see a few real people out there. All right, let's go on to our third and final speaker, who really needs no introduction. I'm sure you all know Emma Veve, who's the Director of Urban Social Development and Public Management and the Public Management Division at the Asian Development Bank, and a regular both organizer and speaker and participant at these Pacific updates. So she was earlier Principal Economist in the Pacific Department. She's worked at the ADB office here in Suva. And before joining the ADB in 2005, she worked with the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat as an economic advisor, and before that worked in the Australian government. And Emma's going to talk on ADB's regional priorities responding to the changing needs of the Pacific. So please welcome Emma.
So I'm the lucky last, and I will take note of that and keep it fairly short and sweet. I just thought with this being a sort of a forward-looking last session, it would be nice to highlight some of the things that are changing in the bank and some of the things that will continue doing the same, and where we're looking in the next few years. So I wanted to talk a bit about our Pacific regional approach, which was released last year and it sets out our operational framework for our work in the Pacific region through to 2020. And it now forms the country partnership strategy for the 11 smaller Pacific Island countries. We still do country-specific strategies for Timor-Leste, PNG, Fiji, and the Solomon Islands. Sorry, not the Solomon Islands, and Fiji. And I think what's also interesting about this report is it sets out the way we operate in the Pacific. That's something we've carried on from the previous Pacific approach, which covered the previous 5 years. And that's things about a focus on partnerships, a focus on country ownership, a focus on building capacity, developing stakeholders' voices, those sort of principles that underlie all of what we do in the Pacific. Sorry, I'm technologically inept here. Which one should I be pressing? It's going. Okay, it's slow. So we've set out 3 strategic priorities for the Pacific, our work in the Pacific. So we'll be looking to create value, reduce costs, and reduce the risks faced by the Pacific countries. Looking at creating value, this is focusing on things like the reforms needed to improve the business environment in particular countries, trying to ramp up our private sector operations in the Pacific, looking at financial inclusion and education and training programs, things that will add value to the economies of the Pacific. We've heard a lot about the costs of the Pacific over the last couple of days, hence the focus on reducing costs. This is some of the things that we've been working on for a number of years: transport, renewable energy, more recently the ICT connections. So to reduce the cost for people living in the Pacific, for governments supplying services, and for businesses operating. Looking at efficiencies within government also through SOE reforms and PPPs. And finally, looking to reduce the risks faced by the Pacific. Again, one of the themes of the update this year is climate change and disaster risk management. It's a risk-prone region. How can we reduce these? Through better disaster response management, through better public sector management, but also through looking at our health and social protection systems in the Pacific. So looking back last year, we approved $850 million across the 14 Pacific Island countries. The ADB includes Timor-Leste as one of those Pacific Island countries. Obviously, the bulk of the funds went to our bigger members, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Timor, but the smaller island countries accounted for about 20% of total approvals. Our major areas of operation are transport, public sector management, and the water sector, with ICT closely catching up to the water sector. We also leveraged a large amount of co-financing, so financing that development partners put through our projects, $223 million last year. What we can see looking over the years is that there's been quite a rapid ramping up of ADB's financial support to the region. By the end of 2016, our active portfolio was over $2.5 billion US, and we had around about 65 active projects across the 14 countries. This year is even more intense for us workers in the ADB than last year was. We're operating in an environment of increasing uncertainty to some degree. We have elections here in the Pacific, and we certainly have had some major elections with some major surprises in the rest of the world. Just what does that mean for the Pacific, I think, is still to come through in detail. Last year we had our merger of our 2 financing sources, which allow us to now provide more money to our developing member countries. The lifting to the $6 million minimum allocation for the smallest Pacific islands started this year. We also have disaster risk funds, regional ADF funds, regional health security funds now, all of which we can tap for use in the Pacific Islands. And looking forward, climate change and disaster risk management will continue to be key, particularly with Fiji's presidency of COP23. During 2017, we'll look to approve around about 28 new projects worth about $1 billion. And on top of that, 30 technical assistance projects for just over 20 million. So it's certainly a scale above what we were doing last year. As I said, we're increasing the resources. You can see here that we're stepping up from 1.6 billion over the 4-year period 2013 through 16 to an expected 2.7 billion over 2017 to 2020. That's an increase both in our market-based OCR funds, but also our concessional ADF funds. And thinking just about those concessional funds, there will be more available because also our grants will be stepping up from just over 150 million to almost 220 million over that period. So all types of money to the Pacific is certainly there in larger amounts than they have been in any years to date. Look, we're having to think about how we can operate more efficiently than we have in the past. We're having more and more regional initiatives where we're recognising similarities in operations across countries. We're implementing our ICT activities on a regional basis. Our renewable energy work, some of you may have heard about earlier today, is also being implemented on a regional basis. We're working on some new and interesting things like the Pacific Disaster Contingent Savings Facility, which will allow a group of countries access to savings funds to draw down in the event of natural disasters. We're ramping up our work on trade and transport facilitation. We're also looking to greatly expand our work in the health sector. There's ongoing work to develop a vaccination project covering 5 Pacific islands. And we're also ramping up our education work. We are about to have a 2-country project approved covering Micronesia and Marshall Islands, focusing on improved quality basic education. So looking at efficiencies in how we can better implement projects by reducing the administrative costs by including more than one country. And innovation will certainly be key to making these funds get out our door and into real changes in the Pacific countries. We're certainly using our policy-based operations more innovatively. Our response to Tropical Cyclone Winston in Fiji saw funds channeled through the government's Help for Homes program, rather than actually designing a project to physically go and build homes for people. So a very different way of doing things. We've developed a contingent credit program for the Cook Islands, a first for the bank. So that was a fairly exciting thing that we've achieved. We're also taking a stronger sector-wide focus. So looking at a whole series of activities in the one sector, in the one country. Our health services sector development program in Papua New Guinea, which is in development, is one really good example of how we're thinking differently about tackling issues in a sector. The Global Climate Fund will also become, we hope, increasingly important for financing of our activities in the Pacific, particularly in renewable energy and water and urban sector investments. We heard earlier today about the grant financing received for the Renewable Energy Investment Facility for the Pacific. So we hope these things will make a change in the speed at which we can realise activities in countries. And finally, the other area of innovation is in ICT, certainly moving from cables, recognising that all the cables that need development bank support are probably in place or will be in place in the next year or so, and moving on to applications in ICT. So actually ensuring countries get the benefit of these cables through e-government, health management systems, revenue, improving revenue collection, education and private sector development through the use of the ICT applications. Of course, there's some challenges to be faced too. As our portfolio continues to grow, project implementation becomes more and more of a priority than it ever was before. We're looking at ways to speed procurement, to speed project implementation, and to leverage benefits across countries. We're also looking at ways in which the vulnerability of the Pacific Islands could be better recognised in the allocation of concessional resources, and ways in which we can get more funds to the Pacific countries. We also recognise that some of the countries that borrow our less concessional financing, Fiji for example, there's times when they might need access to more concessional financing, for example for a post-disaster response. So these are some of the options we're looking through. And as I said before, regional initiatives, certainly we're looking to do more of them, but we recognise that there's a challenge because these do require the country commitment and, importantly, the country cooperation, without which they don't succeed. So some opportunities to try and overcome some of the challenges. ADB as a whole is developing a new strategy, Strategy 2030, and we hope that this will better reflect our response to the challenges and opportunities in the Pacific, and the Pacific will get a much stronger coverage in that than perhaps it did in Strategy 2020. We're also looking forward to the 2019 midterm review of our concessional financing windows to look at ways to get more resources for Pacific member countries. And finally, we're very, very much looking forward to being back in Fiji in 2019 for ADB's annual meeting, which will be held over in the West, and using that as an opportunity to basically show all of our membership and development partners with the ADB how vulnerability really does need greater attention to address the issues and approaches in small island countries in the Pacific. So certainly some challenges, some opportunities, and a lot of work ahead of us, but we're certainly looking forward to continue in the Pacific for another 50 years. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Emma, for that very informative overview of ADB operations. So we are almost out of time. We're just going to have time for one round of questions. Would you like to join up on the front, Josefa? And I know most of you are sitting as far away from me as you can, but I'll try and spot you. Anyone would like to ask a question? Or anyone on this side? Everyone's exhausted. Here we have a question right at the back. Thank you. We'll take a couple of questions, so if anyone else thinks of one, please put up your hand.
Sorry, I didn't want to be too much of an agent provocateur straight up. So, my question, I really would like your feedback from the non-bank perspective, Josefa, but it is a question directed more towards the bank.
Which bank?
Sorry to ADB. Sorry to Robert. So my question is regarding labour mobility and the opportunities for the Pacific with its younger populations and its neighbours having older populations, about potential labour mobility as an economic driver in the region. Obviously, labour mobility has been an issue in the past in terms of things like blackbirding. So how do we make sure that we can increase labour mobility but do it on terms that Pacific people can engage with in their own right, with their own respect, and not just see Pacific people as a resource to be extracted by its neighbours?
Thank you. Okay. Yes, right down. Yep, there's a mic next. We have two mics.
Humphrey Chang, private sector. We're talking about funding here. Much of the funding is always taking place between government to government. The private sector, unfortunately, is somehow left out. The private sector wants to know how the donor countries can help the private sector without government to government taking place only. I mean, far too often the private sector does not know what is going on inside government because we the private sector have not been told. But you know, surely there must be some way in which the private sector can approach the donors and get some help. There are many things that the private sector can do but can't do without funds. Thank you.
Okay, we have one last question, just behind you.
My specific question for Emma regarding health information management and disaster management. My understanding based on my research, there is no active health information management system around Pacific. What is your view, part of your slice and dice of the funding for next 5 years come through the health information management, which can be enabler for ICT development?
Okay, well, thank you. Emma, maybe we'll let you answer first, and then the other two can add on some of the more general questions posed.
Okay, I'll do the health information system first because that's a relatively straightforward one. There certainly are health information systems in the Pacific. I know in PNG we have financed a pilot of a health information system across 3 provinces, and in our new program in PNG we'll be looking to roll that out nationally. The pilot has been very successful. That will be somewhere around $6-7 million to do that. Similarly, we have an already approved project in Samoa to work with other partners there to implement a health management information system. Our contribution to that is about $5 million. The systems themselves are actually relatively cheap. Similarly, we're working with Tonga on a broader e-governance program, of which health is the first cab off the rank, so to speak, and that will have some elements of health information systems within it. And we'd certainly be happy to work more widely in the Pacific on this issue. I might leave the labour mobility issue to Robert because I recognise that World Bank has worked on that extensively. In terms of the question on private sector support, I know the World Bank has the IFC. We have our own private sector operations department who do lend directly to the private sector. They also have other products, equity, credit guarantees, those sorts of things. But the issue in the Pacific tends to be one of scale. So finding investments that work well with what the banks actually are competent in and make sense for our scale of operations. So it's an issue we've been tackling in the Pacific to think how can we work differently for the small and medium enterprises that make up the bulk of the Pacific businesses. We have 2 examples. One is the Pacific Business Investment Facility, which I think has largely been operating here in Fiji. It's relatively small. It works with businesses in a mentoring role and building their capacity to access commercial finance. The other example is in Samoa, where we have a Samoa agribusiness project. It's working with the agribusinesses in Samoa, both to improve their marketing and links to markets, overcoming issues along there, as well as providing credit to those companies. So the Samoa agribusiness one has gone particularly well. We're certainly looking into how we can scale that up to a regional level and pull in other sectors beyond agribusiness. That's certainly a work in progress, but something we're looking to do.
Thank you. On labor mobility, I really should pass it on to Stephen, but I'll give it a try and he can correct me. I think on labor mobility, the issue is really, the schemes that are in place for seasonal labor mobility, those are the ones that you might compare to some of the schemes in the past. Probably not a fair comparison. But I think actually the countries do have fairly strong frameworks in place to prevent abuse. I mean, this doesn't mean that abuse doesn't happen. I think, I mean, it goes through the media quite prominently if something happens, but I think, I mean, there are systems in place that are fairly strong, I think, I mean, to prevent abuse, or at least, I mean, to address it if it happens. But I think, I mean, as also has been discussed over the past 2 days on various occasions, is, I mean, I think, I mean, the first impact is really, it's a positive impact, and there have been various evaluation carried out that really showed the positive impact on the workers, on the receiving countries, on the labor sending countries. But we're certainly now dealing also with the second generation impacts. I think there's some of the negative impacts in terms of the social impacts on the communities, on women that stay back. So I think, I mean, that's something we start to look at. But I think there's also the second generation positive impacts that require quite a lot of attention, and this is really what I think the Minister of Finance of Tonga called, that he really wants to talk about brain circulation. Actually, how can he draw the maximum benefits from the diaspora? That people who gain experience overseas, who have been working in Australia, let's say, now under the new scheme in the tourism sector in the north, actually how can they use those skills and the income that they earn to come back to their countries and set up their own businesses? So that's what I can say, but Stephen probably could give a more profound answer to this.
No, very good answer. Josefa, would you like to comment at all?
Perhaps just quickly on labour mobility, and one of the things about the SDG indicators is that it does include things that can be used to try and maintain the integrity not only of the income, like measuring the cost of recruitment that is borne by the employer, and tracking the cost of remitting funds back. These are examples in the SDG framework that can help with that. There are also things in the SDG framework that can help with the protecting of the rights of migrant workers at workplaces. These I think will, if countries, receiving countries, do comply or do sort of implement the SDG, then they will have to be reporting on workplace security and stuff like that.
Thank you. All right, well, we are out of time, and it is time to wrap things up. So let me just say that the Pacific Update is actually something, with a long lineage. It's an ANU invention. In fact, at the ANU, we run many updates from China, Japan, Indonesia, Korea. Of course, the Pacific Update, I think it's at least 20 years old. We used to run it in Canberra, then we ran it in Canberra and in the Pacific. Then we ran it just in Canberra. And I think it was 3 years ago we decided to have the Pacific Update exclusively here in Suva and the PNG Update in Port Moresby. And I think I can certainly say from the ANU perspective, we think that we're really glad we made that decision. Each of the 3 updates has been terrific, and this year's certainly so. And it's just been great to see so many people here. Perhaps not so many people left right to the end, but some of those parallel sessions you couldn't get a seat in. Right? They were sold out, and there were some great presentations and some very lively discussions, both in the formal sessions, but also over lunch and drinks. So it's been a terrific couple of days, and I think I can say on behalf of all the organisers that we look forward to seeing you again next year. And of course, we'll take on board all your comments. Please do give us your feedback. And one of the good things this year was that we did have a lot more papers. That meant we had to reject more papers. And while it's always sad to reject a paper, the more papers you reject, the higher you think the quality is going to be. And I think this update proved that. So look out for the call for papers, and please do not only come along, but submit a paper. Of course, any event like this is a huge amount of work to organise, and I want to, as my final contribution, just run through the list of people who have made the last 2 days possible. So first of all, from the Asian Development Bank, M.A. Veva, Norio Usui, Maria Mele, Prince Cruz, Rommel Rabanal, Cara Tinio, and Julia Chua. Thank you very much, all of you. Yes. And this is, of course, both work leading up to the update and during the 2 days. Then we have the USP team, Nilesh Gaunda, Rup Singh, Sandra Tart, Janesh Sami, Josephine Singh, Sarojini Chand, Sanjesh Kumar, Ronald Chand, and Pravanesh Chand. And of course, all the USP volunteers, the green team. Thank you very much for all your hard work. Of course, next year we'll be looking for a green and blue t-shirt. Finally, the ANU, we're a somewhat smaller team, but I want to thank my colleague Matt Dornan for all the work he puts into this update, and my colleagues back in Canberra, Ashley Betteridge and Husnia Hushang. And I also want to acknowledge colleagues from the University of Papua New Guinea. I think most of them have actually already left to take the final flight to Nadi and back to Moresby tomorrow. But I think it's great to have more participation from UPNG. And of course, we do invite you all to the PNG update, which normally is also in June, but actually this year is going to be in August, just after the elections. So it'll be a very exciting time to have the update. Please do think about coming to Port Moresby for that. But that's all from me. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you next year.